Today's story starts in chapter 19 of At Home in Mitford, a love story. Come in, honey. We're glad to see a young face around this old folks' home. He hugged Luella with one arm, holding on to the gloxinia he'd picked up at Mitford Blossoms. What have I got to do with that? Asked Luella, who had just lost a finicky Boston fern. Set it in Miss Sadie's window and water it once a week. I could just set it right here and let it get its own water. See yonder? He looked up, peeling paint and a dark stain on the ceiling. That doesn't look good. That leak done filled 2 dishpans and a Dutch oven. Miss Sadie say let it pour, she don't care, long as we catch it in a bucket. Do you think if she was planning to live a while, she'd be getting her a new roof? Well, and if she was planning to keep living, would she be in any hurry to tell you her love story? Luella shook her head. This whole thing's got me worried. Miss Sadie was sitting up in bed, against flowered cushions from her divan, looking bright and expectant in a satin bed jacket. Father, you've brought your famous gloxinia. Luella, if Father ever brings you a gloxinia, you are officially sick. Miss Sadie, you ain't officially sick. Oh, well, whatever. Sit down right here, Father. She patted the arm of a chair that had been pulled up to the bed. He put the flower pot on her sunny windowsill and happily did as he was told. Well now, tell me, he said, unbuttoning his jacket. Are you sick? Not one bit. I'm just tired. Some people get sick confused with tired, but I know tired when I see it, and that's what I am. All those years of eating frozen pies and white bread will make you tired, said Luella, putting her hands on her hips. I'm going down to get lunch ready, and it's going to be greens cooked with a nice piece of side meat. Greens is full of iron, even if they do smell up the place, and they'll be good for what ails you. Ain't that right, Father? She winked at the rector and left the room, closing the door behind her. She is the most encouragement in the world to me, said Miss Sadie with satisfaction. I'd been rattling around in this old house like a seed in a gourd. Now when I sneeze, there's always somebody to say bless you. Someone to say bless you, thought the rector. There's a sermon title. I'm going to get out of this bed in a day or two and be good as new. But tell me about you. Are you missing your dog? Terribly, he said. I would never have dreamed. He cleared his throat and they were silent for a moment. I would never have dreamed that an animal could come to mean so much. Perhaps this sounds foolish, but Barnabas really did have a reflective soul. He was companionable in every way. She looked at him intently. You say he was companionable, and he did have a reflective soul. That is past tense. She held out her hand to him. Life is so short. Let's think in the present tense, shall we? I believe with all my heart you'll get your Barnabas back. She smiled and pressed his hand, which he found immeasurably comforting. Thank you, Miss Sadie. You know, I've come to hear your love story, if you're in the mood to tell it. All I have to do today is see Evie Adams, so we've plenty of time. Evie? What's Miss Patty done now? Gave the angel bird bath away. Oh dear, that landmark bird bath. The last I heard, Miss Patty had climbed out onto the roof and was singing Amazing Grace in her wrapper. I hope I never get old. I believe you passed up the chance some time ago. The nursing home will make a difference, won't it, Father? More than we can know. It's wonderful what comes to mind when you really stop and think. Lying here these last few days has helped me settle a few things. One is, I don't want to call it a nursing home. I know it will be a home and the people in it will have to be nursed, but the whole thing has such a sad ring to it. We're going to call ours something else. Would you help me think of a name? I will. A breeze stirred through the open windows of the bedroom, with its high ceilings and cool hardwood floors. On Miss Sadie's dressing table, Father Tim saw again the old photos in the silver frames. There was the face of the woman so eerily identical to Olivia Davenport, and the brooding, intense gaze of the young man named Willard Porter, whose grand house had been brought to ruin in full view of the whole village. Miss Sadie took a deep breath. Father, she said, what I'm about to tell you has never been spoken to another soul. I trust you will carry it to your grave. Consider it done, he said solemnly, sitting back in the slip-covered chair and finding it exceedingly comfortable. I thought many times about where to begin, she said, folding her small hands and looking toward the open windows. And while it doesn't have much to do with the rest of the story, My mind keeps going back to when I was a little girl playing in these apple orchards. You'll never know how I loved the orchards then, and the way the apples would fall on the grass and burst open in the sun. Then the bees would come and butterflies by the hundreds, and the fragrance that rose from the orchard floor was one of the sweetest thrills of my life. She lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes, smiling. Do you mind if I ramble a bit? I'd be disappointed if you didn't. I used to carry my dolls out under the trees. If you walk down the back steps and go straight past the gate and the old washhouse, and then turn right, that was my favourite place. Luella's mother, China May, loved to go with me. Why, she played with dolls as if she were a little girl herself. She was the most fun, so full of life. I was 9 when we moved here from Wesley into the new house Papa built, and China May was 20. She was my very best friend on earth. She used to call me Little Toad. I have no idea why. I'd love to know, but I'll just have to find that out when I see her in heaven. I hope you're not planning to find that out anytime soon. Of course not. I'm going to live for ages and ages. I have things to do, you know. The clock ticked on the dresser. Back then, there was a big house in Mitford, right where the Baptist church stands today. It's long gone now, but it was named Boxwood, and oh, it was a pretty place. Miss Lorene Thompson owned that house. She was like me, an only child. Her parents both died in a fall from a rock when they were out on a picnic. Their chauffeur was waiting in the car for them to come back, and they didn't come, and when he went to look, Miss Sadie shivered. It was an awful thing, they say. Miss Lorene was so stricken. You know how she tried to get over it? You didn't know. Parties. There was always something fine and big going on at Miss Lorene's, and China May and I were always invited to come by and sample the sweets before a party. Her cook was as big as the stove, and her cream puffs were the best you ever tasted. Not to mention her ambrosia. I've dreamed about that ambrosia several times. She used to make enough to fill a dishpan because people took such a fit over it. Miss Lorene liked to say, the firefly only shines when on the wing. So it is with us. When we stop, we darken. I never forgot that. Oh, we all loved Boxwood. It had so many servants hurrying about, and they all seemed so happy in their work. Miss Lorene was good to her people. Why, when her Packard wore out, do you know who she gave it to? Her chauffeur. He fixed it up good as new and drove it back to Charleston when she died. His name was Soot Tobin. Black as soot, they said. He was a big, strapping man with a stutter so bad he scarcely ever spoke. But when he did, people listened, for his voice was as deep as the bass on a church organ. He made China May fairly giddy. Most everything he'd say, she'd just giggle and go on to beat the band. You know, China May was not all... Well, she never grew up exactly, which is one reason I loved her so. She was just like me. One day, I came home from school and I could not believe my eyes what had happened. China May would never have to play with my baby dolls again, for she had one of her own, just like her. It was lying asleep in the bed with her and had on a little white gown. My mamma was standing by the bed looking at the baby, with tears just streaming down her face. Sadie, she said to me, this is Luella. God has sent her to live with us. Miss Sadie shook her head and smiled at the rector. Isn't that a surprise? To come home from school one day, and there's your second best friend of life sent down from heaven. He laughed happily. If there was anything more amazing and wonderful than almost anyone's life story, he couldn't think what it was. Well, I took after that baby something awful. I rocked her, I bathed her, I pulled her around in a little wagon, I sewed dresses for her. I was as happy as anything to have her to play with and love, and Mama was too. When she got weaned, I started taking her to town. I'd dress her up myself, and they say, here comes Sadie Baxter with that little girl. I never did like to hear that, even as a child. I wanted Luella to be my sister. I played like she was my sister, and then when I'd go to town, they'd say that. So I stopped going. We stayed home and played, and I never did miss going to town. Mama hired a tutor for me anyway, Mr. Kingsley. I declare he had the worst bad breath in the world, but he taught the prettiest cursive you ever saw, and was real good at history. Mama ordered off for all my clothes and shoes, and China May cut my hair, and we went to the doctor and dentist at Papa's lumberyard down the valley. Or sometimes the doctors would drive up the mountain to give us our checkups, and Mother would put on a big spread like the president was coming. We called it Doctor Day, and I didn't take to it one bit. I would grab Luella and we would run off and hide in the orchard. Miss Sadie laughed to herself with her eyes closed. Father Tim could see that she was watching a movie in which he was both the star and the director. He closed his eyes too and quietly slipped his feet out of his loafers. When Luella was about 3, Mama said she was tired of going off and leaving her and China May at home when we marched off to Lord's Chapel. So Mama said that from now on we were all going together. That was what God gave us churches for. Papa didn't like this one bit, but Mama would not let up on him. She got down the Bible and prayer book, and without a shadow of a doubt, she showed him what was what. So China May and Luella and Papa and Mama and me would walk down the road to the old Lord's Chapel that stood on the hill, and we would all sit in the same pew. In a little while, it seemed like nobody noticed anymore that we had our servants with us. It was just the most natural thing on earth. What they said outside the lich gates, I don't know. But if China May missed a Sunday from being sick, lots of ladies would ask about her. Life was better in those days, Father. It really was. When China May did the wash in the wash house and we put the fire under that big iron pot, why, it was an exciting event. China May had joy over making the clothes come clean, while people today would think it was drudgery. We kind of celebrated on wash day. Mama would make a big pineapple upside-down cake, and Luella and I would make stickies out of biscuit dough and cinnamon and sugar. And after that big load of work was done, we all sat down and had a tea party. A bird called outside the open windows, and a breeze filled the fragile marquisette curtains. Father Tim caught himself nodding off, and sat upright at once. You know how the Bible is always talking about the poor? Twice every week, Mama went to see the poor. She would pack a big basket of the best things in the world and put her blue shawl on her head and go off walking to see the poor. She never let me go with her, not once, but she taught me some verses from Proverbs, the 31st chapter. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. That was her favorite in the whole Bible. She said it was her model. Those golden days passed so quickly. I wanted to stay a child forever. But before I felt like I was awake real good, I was 16, and it was time to go abroad. Abroad. What a hateful word. I came to despise it. So many girls would have given anything to go abroad. When I heard that Uncle Haywood had talked Papa into sending me, I was shocked. I felt betrayed. How could he send me away to another country? Mama was horrified too, but she said it was for the best. I know I'd complained about Mr. Kingsley's bad breath 100 times, but I didn't see that as a reason to change my schooling to the other side of the world. Miss Sadie opened her eyes. She was silent for a moment, gazing at the faded yellow roses on the wallpaper. I can just see Papa now. Right before we were ready to go down to Charleston to take the boat, he came in the front door. I remember all the luggage, the big trunks and hat boxes, were stacked in the hall, and Papa came storming in and threw his hat on the table. He was burning mad. I had never seen him so mad. The veins stood out on his neck, and the top of his head was as red as fire where the hair had thinned. Cur, is what he said over and over. He was shouting. I thought a dog had bitten him, but oh, it was so much worse than that. Mama tried to make him sit down and drink a lemonade. It was so hot his shirt was sticking to him. It was August. But he wouldn't, and he started up again, saying things like scoundrel and scum of the earth. It turns out he'd been driving up from the lumber yard in the valley, and somebody had come speeding by him so fast that Papa had run his Buick town car into a ditch, causing considerable damage to the beautiful grillwork and the fenders. Miss Sadie looked at the director. My Papa was a good man, but he was not the kind of man you want to run off the road, and especially not into a ditch. You know, Father, times were different then, and it was considered almost honorable for a man to hold a grudge against an injustice. She sighed. I don't suppose I have to tell you who it was that ran him off the road. No, she did not. Father Tim glanced across the room at the photo of the young, handsome Willard Porter, whose dark gaze seemed to pierce the room so forcibly that he might have been present, listening. Papa had to borrow a car to drive to Charleston, and in those days people did not care to loan their cars, so that upset Papa even more. On the way, he talked about what had happened on Lumber Road. He just couldn't seem to get over it. He didn't know who had done it. He hadn't recognized the car. It was a new car and fancy, and the more he talked about it, the less he acted like himself. Of course, He tried not to talk about me going away, because every time he did, he would cry a little. He'd never spent a night away from Mamma since they were married, and it was a big sacrifice to give us both up at one time, for she was going with me to stay till I got settled. You could have floated that big old boat on our tears, Miss Sadie said, laughing. And to think, buying all those fancy clothes and hats and steamer trunks, and going to Charleston in August of all things, and taking that long trip across the ocean in that big storm that broke a freighter in two, and all those tear-stained, homesick letters, just to turn around and come home again, lickety-split in 2 months. But look what it's given you to remember all these years. With the only irony he had ever heard in her voice, she said, Yes, but look what it did to my heart. Suddenly, an alarm sounded so loudly that it caused his own heart to thunder. Good Lord, he exclaimed, thrusting his feet into his shoes and standing up at once. That's just Luella, she said brightly. Lunch must be ready. Father, dear, would you kindly turn your head and look toward the door? He did so, his ears ringing, as she got out of bed and put on her slippers and robe. Now you can look, she said, going to the wall opposite her bed and grasping what appeared to be a drawer pull under a painting. A little door opened in the wall, and Miss Sadie stuck her head inside. Yes, Luella? Miss Sadie, he heard Luella's mezzo voice boom up the shaft. Do the father want vinegar on his greens? Father, do you want vinegar on your greens? I think not. A little butter, perhaps. Luella, he won't have vinegar. He'll have butter. Butter? I never heard of butter and creams. Miss Sadie, you all want your tea hot or cold? Which is easier? Cold's done fixed. Send cold, said Miss Sadie with some pleasure. And remember, he likes his plenty sweet. Not anymore, said the rector, fidgeting. Luella, not anymore. What'd you say? He doesn't like his tea too sweet anymore. No sugar, he said, feeling as miserable as if he had just delivered an elegy. No sugar in his tea, Luella. Are you coming up? I'm eating right here in this kitchen. Do you all want chow-chow for your beans? Yes, indeed, said the rector, pacing the floor. Chow-chow, Luella, and plenty of it. Don't sound the alarm again. It nearly made him faint. Just knock twice with the broom handle and send it up. He found that the discussion over lunch particulars had given him an odd twinge in his stomach, but the tea, when it came up on the silent butler, revived his spirits. I think it's a dumbwaiter. Silent butler, dumbwaiter. I did not realize that's what it stood for. Father, said Miss Sadie, who was sitting up in bed, having finished her lunch, you can't imagine how wonderful it is to have someone listen to me ramble. Did you ever think that just when people grow old and have so much to tell, that's when people want them to hush? I hope that when you grow old, there'll be someone to listen to you ramble. I feel blessed to have people listen to me ramble every Sunday of my life, he said happily, folding his napkin and putting it on the tray. Oh, pshaw, you're so modest. You never give yourself enough credit, in my opinion. You don't ramble at all, you get right to the point, and it's always God's point as far as I can see. But do you know what I appreciate more than your sermons? What's that? The fact that you love us. Yes, that's enough for me, that you love us. She closed her eyes and let out a lingering breath. Ah, the peace. What a blessing. Father, will you come again tomorrow? Well, I've got the hook in the water, you might say. I don't believe I have the strength to go to the end today. I will, right after lunch. Don't fix for me tomorrow. I'll bring you a donut from Winnie's. Just plain, murmured Sadie. Nothing fancy. He went as quietly as he could across the creaking floor and closed the door behind him. Miss Sadie was sitting in a slip-covered wing chair by the window, with an afghan over her knees. I've been thinking all night, she said, and I don't want to waste a minute. He sat in the wing chair opposite her and unbuttoned his jacket. I have until 3 o'clock, Miss Sadie. My time is yours. When Mama and I met Willard in Paris, we would never have dreamed he was the one who made Papa run off the road. He was so nice, so considerate, so genuine. He had just moved to Mitford from Tennessee, and we learned from his conversation that his family had nothing to speak of. He was a boy who was trying to make the most of his God-given talents, and he was busy inventing things in the pharmaceutical field. One thing he'd invented was Formula R, which stood for rose. Formula R was good to put on burns or wounds. It was an antiseptic, and it just worked wonders, but it stung like fire. We had the sweetest times together in Paris. My mama was a wonderful judge of character, and while she had a soft heart, she could not be fooled. She thought Willard was a fine person, but when we got home and we started telling Papa about the Mitford boy who befriended us, in that faraway place, why, I thought he would have a stroke. I couldn't believe the horrible anger that welled up in him, something I had never seen before in my life. He said Willard Porter was trash, the lowest kind, an uneducated, penniless, heathen boy with no future and no breeding, and we were never to mention his name in our house again. He was so mean to Mamma, as if she had betrayed him. I found that Papa had dealt with Willard after Willard came home from Paris, because when I saw Willard driving around the monument one day, he acted as if he hadn't seen me. All the way over on the boat, I had dreamed of seeing him again. The fact that he lived in my hometown was just too joyful for words. And then to come home to that cold anger and rage, and a Papa who scarcely seemed to be the same person. One day, China May brought me a note. It was folded up little bitty and hidden in her dress. It was from Willard, and when I saw the handwriting, the same handwriting on the notes that came with the roses in Paris, I remember that my heart beat so wildly I had to sit down. China May said, "Don't you dare faint. Fainting is too wrong for words." I still have that little note. It said, "I have made the very worst mistake of my life. The incident on the road was inexcusable and completely unintentional. I deeply regret that I have caused this strife, and I am willing to do anything within my power to remove the memory of it. I have apologized to your father with heartfelt sincerity, but he will not hear me. I do not know what more can be done at this time. Please forgive me. Your faithful servant, Willard James Porter." "Mamma," I said, "I think I love Willard." She said, "Don't even speak of it. Don't let your heart think such a thing. It's impossible. This has changed your father in a way I don't understand. Just like when I was a little girl, I stopped going to town. We ordered off for my clothes just like always, and I didn't even cut my hair. Mamma helped me study, and I played the piano and did needlework, and read books and went to church every evening, and lit a candle and knelt down and talked to God. You would have thought the heavens had been barricaded against me, as if God had said, 'Nail everything up good and tight, in case Sadie Baxter tries to get through.' It seemed a long time later that China May said someone was building a big house over in town, a big showplace, all white with porches and gables, and even a widow's walk, though there was no ocean for hundreds of miles. Everybody at church was talking about it, and talking about Willard, how he had sold some of his pharmaceutical inventions, and how he was getting rich. Something awful happened to Papa when his name was mentioned at church, or wherever. You would think that the years would soften his heart toward a foolish, unfortunate incident, but they didn't. You know, Father, looking back, Papa was a lot like Willard. He came from nothing. He had no special education. He was a rough man in many ways, but he refined himself and taught himself to speak well and read good books and travel in polite society, just like Willard. China May came home now and again, all excited. "I seen him, Miss Sadie," she'd say. "I seen your Willard, and he's just the handsomest man you ever laid eyes on. He opened up a pharmacy on Main Street where Happy Endings is now, and one in Wesley, and 2 in Holding. I received a letter from him one day out of the blue. I'd like to show this one to you. Would you be so kind, Father, to step to the dresser and look in the top right drawer?" He opened the drawer and was struck by the scent of lavender that rushed out at him. He found the ivory envelope just where she said it was and took it back to his chair by the window. He removed the brittle stationery, unfolded it, and saw that the date at the top was June 13th, 1927. He read aloud, "My dear Sadie, I saw you go by yesterday, and though you did not see me, I was very touched by your sweetness and grace. I know it is risky to write to you, and have firmly emphasized to China May that you must burn this letter after reading it. I implore you to do so, as I take this liberty with the greatest concern for your happiness. I once said that when you grow up, I should like to marry you. Today you are 21, and I believe that is considered by all to be grown up. As for myself, I'm 26. My business is at last going well, and I'm beginning to make a place for myself, my mother, and my little sister. For the first time it is possible for me to marry, and yet it is impossible for me to marry the one I love devotedly and think about night and day. I do not know your feelings for me, except what China May has confided. Please, I beg you, do not punish her for speaking out of turn. I have tried again and again to think of a way to change your father's mind toward me, but I come each time to the same bitter conclusion. He despises me, and anything I might try to do to win your hand would only bring turmoil and despair to you and to your mother. You may know that I'm building a house in the village, on the green where Amos Mitford grazed his cows. Each stone that was laid in the foundation was laid with the hope that I might yet express the loving regard I have for you, Sadie. It is bold to write to you so, but I am filled with a longing on this, your 21st birthday, that is nearly inexpressible. I'm going to give this house a name, trusting that things may eventually be different between us. I will have it engraved on a cedar beam at the highest point in the attic, with the intention that its message may one day give you some joy or pleasure. Perhaps, God willing, your father will soon see that I have something to offer and relent. Until then, dear Sadie, I can only offer my fervent love and heartfelt devotion. Father Tim sat for a time silently, and then put the letter back into the ivory envelope. She turned her head and looked out the window. It was a warm, bright spring day. Such a waste, she said simply. He waited. I prayed for Papa, for God to give him a new heart, like he gave Saul, but he did not. In those days, 21 was an old maid, and I believe Papa was sometimes sorry that no one courted me. But there was no one, you see. There was only Willard. And then, 2 or 3 years later, there was Absalom Greer. Miss Sadie's eyes twinkled. Absalom Greer, another uneducated man. I never could get it right, which of course is why Uncle Haywood wanted me to go off to Paris, France, and then debut in Atlanta, where I'd meet all those fancy boys. He told Papa if I stayed in Mitford, I would wind up an old maid, or with dishpan hands, married to a farmer. I never did like Uncle Haywood, she said flatly. By the way, did you bring my donut? Your donut, said the rector, patting his jacket pocket and bringing out a bag that had mashed rather flat. I'm sorry to say that Winnie was out of donuts. All she had was left was the holes, so I brought you 4. 4 donut holes, said Miss Sadie solemnly, peering down into the bag. They can't be very filling, can they? She laughed suddenly, and for the first time he saw the girl she had been. It lasted only a moment, the face of the girl, but there it was, and something in him connected with the young Sadie. Absalom Greer worked for Papa at the lumber yard. Of course, I never went down there much, but when I did, I liked it. I had taken to sitting rather gloomily around the house, just to show Papa how wicked he'd been, and how I hadn't forgotten what he'd done. He said that what I needed was fresh air and hard work, so he took me down to the lumber yard and put me in his office and opened all the windows, and that was the fresh air. Then he sat me down with an adding machine and ledgers, and that was the hard work. I made Papa sound like such a mean man, but oh, I loved him, and he could be such fun. Some days he would just relax and laugh and pet me to beat the band, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not teach me to keep those hateful books. One day, a young man knocked on the office door, and I opened it, and there he was, a big, tall boy, as slim as a beanpole, wearing a cap and carrying a Bible. There was a kind of electricity about him. He looked down at me and said, Miss Sadie Baxter, are you saved? Why, I declare I didn't know what on earth he was talking about. I looked straight up at him and said, Well, I'm not lost. He was the cutest thing, so tall and jovial. He had the heartiest laugh and the nicest smile, and knew how to talk plain. I just felt so at home with him, like I had a brother, and he was so excited about the Lord and about the Bible. Once, Papa came in and Absalom was sitting there reading me a Bible story on his dinner break. He didn't miss a beat. He just raised his voice and read louder. Papa went and sat down at his desk. He was amazed. I don't think he knew what to do about it, so he didn't do anything. It kind of made me nervous, but Absalom read all the way to the end of 2 Samuel, then got up, put his Bible under his arm, tipped his cap, and went back to work. Father Tim laughed with delight. That was another picture of the boy who had been delirious with God, the one who had come home from the silver mine and had been knocked out of bed one night with a 2x4 and had gotten up at last to answer God's call. Every day at dinner time, we called it dinner then, you know, Papa was usually out on the yard, and Absalom would come in and read to me. What a beautiful voice he had, and how hard he tried to polish his diction and improve his speech. It was a wonderful thing to watch, someone with so little schooling and so much yearning. Then came the day he asked if he could court me. Ask Papa, I said with fear and trembling. I had never been courted in my life, and I was nearly 25 years old. My father was the richest man in Mitford or Wesley, and a labourer out of his lumber yard was asking to court me. I didn't see one ray of hope in it. I remember I was so excited and upset. I ran to the back door and heaved up, if you'll pardon the expression, Father. The next morning on the way to the yard, Papa was looking straight ahead at the road, and he said, Sadie, Absalom Greer has asked if he can court you. What do you think about it? I couldn't believe my ears that Papa was asking me what I thought about something. I said, Papa, I've prayed about it, and I would like to be courted by Absalom Greer. My heart beat so hard I thought I would pass out, but I always remembered that China May thought fainting was too silly for words, so I never did it. Well then, Papa said, I'm going to give him my permission. Papa, I said, thank you for your permission, but what I would covet is your blessing. He must have given it to us, for Absalom was allowed to come to our house. He ate Sunday supper with us before he preached in the evenings, and often I'd go with him and sit on the front row. We were allowed to drive Papa's town car on special occasions, and once Papa gave Absalom a beautiful suit that was cut too slim, and it fit Absalom like it was made for him. I'll never forget what Mama said. She said, "My, you look like a Philadelphia lawyer." That pleased Absalom so much. You should have heard him preach, Father. Why, he'd take the fuzz off a peach. Lord Chapel hadn't had a fine preacher for a long time, and I was starved nearly to death to hear such wondrous things about salvation and redemption and Christ's suffering for me. Absalom made it all so personal, as you often do, and under his preaching, the Bible came alive for me. He was the one who tried to teach me the great meaning of Philippians 4:13. A banner verse, he thought, smiling. But Absalom was like a brother. I still loved Willard. Now that I was getting out and about more, I would often see Willard, and the pain of that was very deep. His house was finished, of course, and the most beautiful sight in town. It was more wonderful than Boxwood. They said Willard worked all the time. Even though he joined the new country club, all he did was work. He joined the Presbyterian church, and he worked over there too. Why, he helped them raise enough money for a new building in a little over a year, and in those days that was something to crow about. All this time Rose wasn't doing well. They didn't know much about her disease, and they still don't, I'm told. But he took such good care of her. And then his mother passed away, and it was just the two of them in that grand house, a lonely man and a confused girl. Father, there were times when my heart was so broken for him that I wanted nothing more than to knock on his door and go into him and never leave. But something happened after a while, after 2 or 3 years of courting Absalom. It wasn't that I no longer cared for Willard, but the caring had worn me out. I was very tired from caring so much and loving so much, hoping. She took a sip of water from a glass on the windowsill. Papa and Mum had come to like Absalom, and even though he had no money, and probably never would, they were happy with things, and all the hurt and the anguish seemed in the past. I would not have wanted to upset that delicate balance for anything in the world. When I'd see Willard, he would tip his hat to me, though rumor had it that Papa had threatened to kill him if he ever spoke to me. It's a hard thing to have to change your opinion of someone you love, and my opinion of Papa was changing, no matter how hard I tried to hold it back. It was like trying to hold back the ocean. The lumber business got awful bad, and I don't think our finances had ever recovered from the money that was spent on Fernbank. You've never seen the little ballroom with the painted ceiling. It's been closed up all these years, but that alone cost a fortune. The man who painted it came from Italy and lived here 34 months. And of course, just look at all this mill work. Nobody in western North Carolina had finer, except Mr. Vanderbilt, of course. Father, you know how word gets around in a small town. And the word got around about our circumstances, and Willard heard it, and he approached Papa and offered to buy him out. I know why Willard did that. It was one way of saying, "Here, let me give you a good price for your business and save your face, and make things right after all those years." But Papa didn't take it that way. It made him so angry, thinking that Willard pitied him, that we thought he was going to have a heart attack. Mama said, "I am sick and tired of this hateful, evil battle between you and a man who made a foolish mistake and lived to regret it and said so. I will no longer tolerate the dark spirit it brings into this house and into my husband and into the heart of my child, and I beg you in the name of all that's holy to meet with Willard Porter and face him like a gentleman and settle your differences and ask God to forgive you." That was the single boldest thing I ever heard my mother say. Do you know that my father bowed his head and wept? Mother went and stood beside him and put her arm around him, and I dropped down at his feet and clasped my arms around his legs, and we all cried together. China May was standing outside the door, and tears were streaming down her face, and she was praying and thanking God. Miss Sadie drew a handkerchief from her robe pocket and touched her eyes. It's all as clear to me as if it happened yesterday. I remember the fire was crackling in the fireplace, and Papa said we'd need more wood. They were calling for a big drop in the temperature. It was January. He stood up and hugged us both, and Mama said, "Why not see if you can meet with Mr. Porter now, while your resolve is fresh, and come home to the night's sleep you've been needing for so long?" "I'll do it," he said, and I remember that he trembled as he rang the operator and asked for Willard Porter. He told Willard he had to go to church to take care of something. He was the senior warden, and it would be a fitting place to settle their differences if he'd care to meet him there. It was awkward for Papa, I could tell. Mama was standing beside me, holding onto my arm for dear life. I don't think she drew a breath till that phone call was ended. I don't know why, but I was very troubled. Mama went to her room to pray and asked me to pray, and I did. I got on my knees beside my bed. Then I got up and put on my alpaca cape with the hood and my fur gloves. It was very cold, and I let myself out the front door. I just started walking to the church, and even though it was pitch dark, it was nearly like walking from my dining room to the kitchen. It was all so familiar to me. I don't know what I expected or why I went. I just seemed pulled along. I remember how loud my heart was beating in my ears. Ice had formed all along the road. In some places, it was slippery and dangerous, and I kept just walking in that bitter cold and grave darkness. You know where the old steps are in the stone wall along Church Hill Drive? Well, I went up those icy steps, holding on to the railing, and I could see that Papa's and Willard's cars were parked in the back of the church, because the moon came out all at once. Miss Sadie pulled the afghan up around her shoulders and shivered slightly. Father Tim was suddenly aware that she looked very old, something he'd never seemed to notice before. When I reached the door, I heard their voices, and they were not the peaceful voices I had longed to hear. They were angry and shouting. Papa was accusing Willard of trying to humiliate him in front of the town, and Willard said he had come to make peace, and he didn't care to hear any more insults and lies. The door was standing open, and I could see them so clearly. Papa had lit an oil lamp. It was sitting on the little table at the back of the nave, and I remember a strong smell of linseed oil that came off the floors. They'd just been done for a wedding the next Sunday. Papa was standing on one side of the table, and Willard was standing on the other. I wanted to rush in and stop them from arguing, but I felt frozen to the spot. I knew that Papa had left the house with the truest of intentions in his heart, but somehow the enemy had snared him along the way. Papa swung his fist at Willard, and Willard stepped back. Papa's arm sent the oil lamp reeling off the table, and it dashed against the floor, and an awful flame leapt up. It was all so sudden and so horrible. I cannot tell you how quickly that sheet of flame raced across the oiled floor. I felt that the very soul of evil had been unleashed, and still I could not move, though I remember I heard myself screaming. I turned and ran home as fast as I could, falling on the ice and trying to keep to the sides of the road where it wasn't so slick. I turned around and looked back once, and I saw the church lighted up inside. It was so horrible I shall never forget that sight as long as I live. For years I prayed I might die, so that the memory of it would be erased. I crept into the house and went upstairs and looked out my window. The flames were already leaping around the wooden walls, and it seemed the fields were lighted up for miles around. They said that when the fire truck came, the water was frozen and there was no way to do anything but watch it burn. Water everywhere was hard as stone, and there was only that searing flame licking the hilltop. Miss Sadie closed her eyes and let out a shuddering sigh. "They have cast fire into thy sanctuary," she quoted slowly from the 74th Psalm. "They have defiled by casting down the dwelling place of thy name to the ground." She rested her head against the cushion of the chair. The clock ticked in the room. The rector felt his heart beat dully. How had this small woman contained this large secret for so long? "My father," she said, keeping her eyes closed, "told the fireman he had gone to church to check the pipes because of the freezing temperatures, and when he arrived he found it already burning. Willard Porter had left the scene, and no one knew he'd been there. They suspected arson. The grief that I suffered was nearly unendurable. I could not get out of bed. In fact, it was this very bed in this very room. I kept the draperies closed and lived as if in a dream. I felt invalid and frail. I began to creep about like an old woman. I couldn't confide to China May, my best friend, and certainly not to Luella, nor say a word to Mama, whose worry over me nearly drove her to the breaking point. I refused to see Absalom, yet one day he delivered a note to the house, asking me to marry him. Marry. Miss Sadie shook her head. I knew at last full well that I would never marry. My father never revealed the truth to anyone, and he was so gravely stricken with guilt and shame that I thought he might die. The doctor drove up the mountain to Fernbank regularly. We were also ravaged by our secrets and our sorrows. For me, it wasn't just all that I'd seen and the knowledge of Papa's deceit. There was also an awful sadness over the loss of Lord's Chapel the sweetest church in Mitford. It was a very long time until I learned that Papa had commanded Willard to leave the scene of the fire, and Willard, for all those years, was willing to protect Papa. He never said a word. He took the truth to his grave in France. It seemed that Satan himself had come against us. I thought Luella would never get over the horror of that time. Our faith did not shine through, Father. Even my mother was broken by the burden of what she could not understand. She reached for the glass on the windowsill and took another sip of water. Papa's business regained its footing, and he rallied to raise the money to build Lord's Chapel on Old Church Lane. He bought your little stone office, which had been an ice house, and gave it to the parish. The rectory was already owned by the church and standing where it is today. When the time came, Papa gave the pews and the organ and put the roof on the nave and sanctuary. That was before the parish hall. And he had the gardens dug and planted. I feel that Papa would have let me marry Willard at last, but it was too late. Oh, it was so late. When the war started, of course, Willard went away to serve, and he was killed in France and buried there. She paused, gazing out the window. And Absalom? Well, I scarcely ever saw him again. I know that his sister Lottie could not find it in her heart to forgive me, for I hurt him, and she loved him so. When Papa and Mama died, I did perhaps the only independent thing I have ever done in my life. She looked at him and smiled weakly. I moved across the aisle and started sitting on the gospel side. She slumped a little in her chair. He leaned forward and reached for her hand, which felt small and cold. That's my love story, Father. I'm sorry it did not have a happier ending. The nursing home will give it a happy ending. The building will be given in honor of Mama and Papa. That beautiful fountain out front will be in memory of Captain Willard James Porter. It will be a place of solace and peace, a place for healing. Father Tim got up from his chair and placed a hand on her fragile shoulder. Father, he prayed, I ask you to heal any vestige of bitter hurt in your child Sadie, and by the power of your Holy Spirit, bring to her mind and heart, now and forever, only those memories which serve to restore, refresh, and delight. Through Jesus Christ, your Son and Lord. Amen. Amen, she said, reaching up to put her hand on his. Y'all been talking so long you must be dry as two bones. Luella set a tray on the foot of the bed and handed out tall glasses of tea with bright circles of lemon. Thank you, Luella. Please sit down. The deed is done. Thank you, Jesus, said Luella, and sat down on Miss Sadie's blue silk vanity bench. Have a donut hole, Luella, said Miss Sadie, extending the bakery bag. Father, she said, offering him one also. How much harm could the whole of a donut do? He wondered, reaching into the bag. That, Miss Sadie exclaimed happily, leaves two for me. The rector noticed that her color was returning. Oh, Father, something I've been meaning to ask you. You know that lovely woman who looks like Mama? Olivia Davenport, I think her name is. I'd like to give her Mama's hats. She wears a hat with such style. You know, there's no family to pass them on to, and there are just so many beautiful hats up in the attic going to waste. Do you think it would be an insult? Why, no, I don't. I think Olivia would be very glad to have those hats. Perhaps you could call her and talk to her. I believe she'd welcome hearing from you. She's rather shut in, you know. She's going to get a new heart, isn't she? God willing. She's on a waiting list, but she has a rare blood type, and the heart could come from anywhere in the world. The trick is getting it to her, or her to it, in time. A new heart. How thrilling. I will pray for her, Father, and I'll call her in the next day or two. Could you run them over to her if she's interested? Would you mind? I could get Luther to take them in a pickup, but he hurt his back and can't drive. We'll most certainly work it out, he said, draining the tea glass and standing. He bent down and kissed Miss Sadie on the forehead. Take good care of one another, he said. I'll be in touch. Luella followed him out the door and closed it behind her. She walked with him to the foot of the stairs. Father, she said, speaking in a low voice, Miss Sadie ain't the only one got a secret to carry to the grave. I got one of my own, and something tells me I better let you have it, just in case. Good heavens, thought the rector. No wonder he had never felt the need to devour mystery and suspense stories. Nearly every day he encountered mysteries and suspense galore. If I was you, I wouldn't let Miss Olivia and Miss Sadie get too thick. You know how folks always say who was your mama and your grandma, and where was you born at and all. One thing might lead to another, and before you know it, Miss Sadie might find out something that would put her down for sure. He was afraid to ask. And what is that? That her mama done had a little baby before she married Miss Sadie's daddy, and that little baby growed up and was the grandma of Miss Olivia. Luella peered closely at the rector's face. Now, don't take me wrong. Miss Sadie's mama, she was a saint. She used to go round to the poor, just like the Bible asks us to. And the poor she was mostly going round to was that little girl who didn't live too far from Fernbank, kept by a lady from Alabama. That little girl had the name Miss Lydia. Well, she growed up and had Miss Caroline, and Miss Caroline done had Miss Olivia. And far as I know, don't nobody know nothing. They smoothed it out so. You know what's sad? What's that? Asked the rector, who had heard so much of sadness today. Miss Sadie always talking about how she's got no kin, when her own kin is right down the hill, and Miss Olivia thinking she's got no kin either. Luella, thank you for telling me this. Will you agree with me in prayer? Honey, you know I will. The psalmist tells us that God setteth the solitary in families. Let us pray that it might please God to make these two a family in his own way. Cast your bread on the waters, said Luella, grinning broadly. And sometimes, replied the rector, it comes back buttered toast. He drove along Churchill Drive, beside the stone wall that led to the ruined church. He would never again be able to look at that hilltop without a kind of sorrow. His particular job sometimes revealed more to him than he wanted to know. There, he thought, as he made a right-hand turn into Old Church Lane, was where he'd first come panting up the hill in his new jogging suit from the collar button. That innocent time seemed long ago. He felt a keen anguish over Barnabas as he drove slowly down the hill, but reminded himself that after all, Barnabas was only a dog. Only a dog? Instantly he realized where this perverse thought had come from. He'd stood by the cages with his father, surveying in frozen alarm the dead bodies of his entire herd. There's no use to grieve, his father had said coldly. They're only rabbits. He'd learned that one obstacle to childlike faith in a heavenly Father was bitter disappointment in earthly fathers. No, not everyone had that obstacle to faith, which was clearly a favorite of the enemy, but Miss Sadie had had it, he had had it, and come to terms with it, and forgiven his father long years ago. His research for the paper on Lewis revealed this had been a major obstacle for the apologist. One commentator had said, for years, Lewis had not been able to forgive himself for his failure to love his father, nor had he been able to appropriate God's forgiveness for this sin. But when finally enabled, he was almost incredulous of the peace and the ease he experienced. He glanced vaguely at the rose arbors that had come into bloom along Old Church Lane. The Rose Festival. He still had no inkling of what to talk about. The War of the Roses? No, there was enough talk of war in this world. He would think about it all later, perhaps in the evening when Dooley was asleep. Of course, what he really needed to think about was what to do with Dooley for the summer. And then there was always what Cynthia had asked him to think about. He felt oddly relieved to arrive at the office and have the peace of it to himself. He checked his phone messages and calendar. Meet with the Altar Guild at 3 o'clock about designs for needlepoint kneelers to replace the ancient leather-covered cushions. Dinner at Wilma and Ron Malcolm's with Dooley in tow tomorrow evening. Drop by the local and pick up a ham to bake for the Newland reception on Saturday. Should he have warned Miss Sadie, who was hoping to be there, that Absalom Greer would be there also? A note from Emma said, Winnie expecting you. Olivia fine, Russell behaving, rabbit food on sale. As he took the cover off his royal manual to type a quick note to Stuart Cullen, he heard a thunderous sound out front and felt the building shake. There was the explosive whooshing of air brakes, and in a moment a loud rap on the door. He opened it to see a truck as vast as an auditorium parked in the street. Yes? He inquired of a large, bearded man with a cut of tobacco in his jaw. Bells, said the driver, handing him a clipboard with a delivery slip. And tomorrow we'll do chapter 20. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed. Whew, what an emotional chapter. Love stories get me right here. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you tomorrow.